Knowing that Superman is a character primarily known for this sort of thing...
Dreams save us. Dreams lift us up and transform us into something better. And on my soul, I swear that until my dream of a world where dignity, honor, and justice are the reality we all share, I'll never stop fighting.
Imagine you're an executive at Warner Brothers. You're in charge of picking a creative team for a new Superman movie. Who would you pick to write the movie? Who would you pick to direct it? It's an interesting question, and a pretty difficult one. I think there's lots of valid answers. DC Warner Brothers picked this guy, Zack Snyder. And I can kind of understand why they thought that was a good choice. Almost every movie Snyder's ever done has been an adaptation, including movies like Watchmen, which deals with some really complex subjects. He's a director who's familiar with the superhero genre, and he's certainly savvy in terms of visuals, but I wonder if the people in charge of hiring him actually watched any of his movies? They're all kind of dark as hell.
I was young then, too soft on criminals. I let them live.
Christ! Look, I've got a problem, man. Fucking take me in. I need help. No, don't do that! Take me in! No! No!
That clip is from Watchmen, which was an adaptation of Alan Moore's extremely dark graphic novel that was a commentary on and deconstruction of comic book superheroes. Snyder also remade Dawn of the Dead, a gorier and more frantic adaptation of George A. Romero's classic. Snyder's perhaps best known for 300, a dark and gritty adaptation of Frank Miller's dark and gritty graphic novel based very loosely on historical events. So yeah, Snyder's used to adapting existing works, but he only adapts certain kinds of works. He really only makes action-oriented movies that deal with dark or horror-inspired themes. And when adapting those kinds of stories, he does alright. His movies are generally enjoyable for what they are. So even if, like me, you enjoy some of his adaptations, we should also consider the opinions of their original creators. Since Snyder primarily does adaptations, wouldn't the mark of a good adaptation be that it captures the spirit or meaning of the original? That it had the seal of approval from the person who originally created it? With this question in mind, I turned to interviews and commentaries with the minds behind those original stories. Here's some of what I found. For Dawn of the Dead, I found an interview George A. Romero did with The Telegraph. See, Romero thinks that the movie loses the point of the original, that it completely lacks the anti-consumerist symbolism that was basically the reason behind setting it inside of a shopping mall. Romero said that, in his eyes, Snyder's remake is just this vapid summer Hollywood blockbuster, designed to make money based on the brand name alone. Which he says is damn ironic, because that's exactly what the original was trying to speak out against. That's a really strong condemnation. I'm getting a little ahead of myself with this next one, but did you know that Man of Steel's plot is actually pretty much a direct adaptation of another Superman story? It's one we already talked about too, back when I was listing stories that showcase Superman's inherent optimism, and ones that understand what makes him so easy to empathize with. It's Superman Earth 1. Now, Straczynski didn't create Superman, but he did write this story, so his opinion on what Man of Steel did to that story can give us some pretty valuable insight. Lucky for us, with the recent release of Volume 3 of Earth 1, Straczynski devotes the entire book to his reaction to Man of Steel. There's actually one panel in the comic that directly addresses Goyer and Snyder. Here's what Straczynski had to say to them. I think it's pretty obvious he's not a big fan. It was hard not to laugh while reading this. Next, let's take a look at Watchmen creator Alan Moore. This one's a little bit complicated. Moore is very anti-Hollywood to begin with, and he's got really strong feelings about adaptations in general, so I think he had it out for Snyder even before Watchmen was made. In an interview he did with Entertainment Weekly, Moore mirrors a lot of the same sorts of things that Romero said. He cites Snyder's take on 300 as his reason for disliking Snyder as a director. The interviewer asks Moore how he would make his own version of Watchmen. He responded with this. Back in the 80s, when Terry Gilliam asked me how I would make Watchmen into a movie, I said I wouldn't. There are things that we did with Watchmen that could only work in a comic, and were designed to show things that other media can't. I think Terry eventually came to see things my way. That's an interesting take, but I'm actually going to defend Snyder here a little bit because I liked his take on Watchmen. He didn't change very much from the original, and what little he did change really was just those parts that could only work in comic form. However, the fact that so many people enjoyed Watchmen anyway really doesn't invalidate what Moore's saying. You have to concede to Moore that his original vision probably is unfilmable. Now, before I get accused of leaving some details out, to be completely fair to Snyder, in the case of 300, he worked very closely with Frank Miller. So, in this case, there's not much of a gap between the original and the adaptation. Although, I think if you find yourself agreeing with Frank Miller, you've probably got bigger things to worry about. This is a pretty interesting subject, but my point in showing you all of these creator interviews is that there tends to be a bit of a controversy between them and Snyder. Snyder does aesthetics, and he does them really well, which is commendable. Even I'll admit, just editing this review series with clips from Man of Steel, I came to realize just how beautiful a movie it is. The clarity and composition of scenes and shots sometimes catches me off guard, and there's some really gorgeous imagery in here. But when it comes to Snyder's adaptations, I think we can see that he usually fails to capture the symbolism behind those aesthetics, the deeper meaning behind those works. Another way of saying this is, I think Snyder nails the exterior of the adaptations, but misses the interior. Probably the biggest criticism you'll hear of Snyder as a director is that his movies tend to have a very cold and detached feeling to them, especially personified in action scenes that don't really have any connection to the audience, regardless of how visually impressive they are. When it comes to Watchmen, I think this approach really worked. Watchmen is at times a very dark, cold, and emotionally disconnected story. That was often the point. So, while Snyder's usual approach works for something like Watchmen, applying it to a character like Superman was a poor choice right from the get-go. Making a cold and detached Superman would be a disaster for obvious reasons. It's the same sort of criticism often aimed at Snyder's friend and Man of Steel consultant Christopher Nolan. They use these huge action set pieces, they aspire to these grand ideas and really want to try and tell something deeper, but on a personal and emotional level, they really fail to connect to the audience. They're sort of like a more ambitious version of Michael Bay.
An 18-wheeler spins out of control, and it's all like, brush! In this huge tanker full of diamonds, craw, craw! Those aren't ideas, those are special effects! I don't understand the difference.
So, not only would Snyder not have been my first choice for a Superman movie, I don't think he'd even make the list. Regardless, that was who Warner chose to direct their Superman movie. Now, what about a writer? With what we know about Snyder and Nolan in mind, you'd have to pick someone that can make up for any of their weaknesses in storytelling. You'd have to get a writer who does very clear and emotionally connected characters, and can do a really meaningful story. You need a writer not at all like Snyder is. Who would you have picked? Well, DC picked a guy named David S. Goyer, who helped write the Dark Knight trilogy with Christopher Nolan. You can probably see where I'm going with this. If you're currently alive, you've probably seen at least one of the Nolan Batman movies, and regardless of your opinion of those, you probably don't need me to tell you that there should be an obvious difference between Christian Bale in a batsuit murdering people and a guy like Superman. I mean, it's a pretty stark contrast, so maybe, just maybe, Man of Steel wasn't as stark a contrast as it should have been.
You think you've attacked my mother?
This is an issue I often think about with comics, that people who write for Batman probably shouldn't also write for Superman. Maybe with the exception of Grant Morrison. Take Bruce Timm's DC animated universe, for example. While Batman the Animated Series became a huge hit, Superman the Animated Series never really soared to the same heights, apart from a few standout episodes. On a side note, one of the things that bugged me about Nolan's Batman trilogy was how Batman wasn't supposed to use guns. Pew pew! That's more guns than I've ever used. Anyway, Goyer has got a pretty lengthy filmography. He's been writing and helping write things long before Batman. Movies like Dark City, which I kinda loved as a kid, even though I haven't seen it in ages. He also wrote the Blade movies for Marvel. People mostly remember those pretty fondly. He also did the second Crow movie, which was the last one that was, any good. So, similar to Snyder's choices in direction, Goyer tends to write these same kind of dark, horror-inspired stories. So instead of making up for Snyder, I think they're kind of best friends. It's the exact same problem. I know that after Green Lantern bombed, DC kind of became desperate to avoid jokes, but the danger here was that choosing Goyer would be kind of overcompensating. Someone like him would bring seriousness or darkness, but then he'd keep it there relentlessly. Or maybe not, he wrote that too. Jesus, does he hate superheroes or something? Well, actually, it kinda seems that way. There's a bit of an elephant in the room when it comes to David Goyer. That elephant's name is Script Notes. Script Notes is a discussion and interview-style podcast about movies, comics, and whatever else has scripts, I guess. They invited Goyer on to talk about whatever he wanted to talk about. Unfortunately, he wanted to talk about his theory on She-Hulk, namely that she's a big green porn star conceived as a sex toy for the Hulk. Here, I'll read it to you. I have a theory about She-Hulk, which was created by a man, right? And at the time, in particular, I think 95% of comic book readers were men, and certainly almost all of the writers were men too. So, the Hulk was this classic male power fantasy. It's like most of the people reading comic books were these people like me, who were just these little kids who were getting the shit beaten out of them every day. And they're like, what if I became a giant and could clap my hands and create a sonic boom? And so then they created She-Hulk, right? Who was still smart. And so it was like, I think She-Hulk is the chick that you could bang if you were Hulk. You know what I'm saying? This is another issue I could devote an entire video to, but let's try to keep this on topic. You don't have to be a big fan of She-Hulk to get a sense of the ignorance shown in what Goyer's saying. It does help though. The short version is that She-Hulk was never meant to be a love interest for the Hulk and is, in fact, his cousin. You might say Goyer's comments got a lot of negative responses online. Even Stan Lee, co-creator of She-Hulk, responded to Goyer's frothing sexism and ignorance. Lee says, "Never for an instant did I want her as a love interest for the Hulk. Only a nut would even think of that." See, Lee loved the idea of a strong Hulk-like character that still had intelligence. That was the motivation behind her creation. But guess what? The podcast kept going after all that She-Hulk nonsense. I guess Goyer wanted to make sure he offended as many comic fans as possible that day? Goyer poses a question to the audience. He says, "How many people in the audience have heard of Martian Manhunter?" And the audience raises their hands. Then Goyer says, "How many people that just raised their hands have ever been laid?" Why is everything always about sex with this guy? Now, to most people, Goyer sounds pretty damn ignorant. I agree with Kevin Smith that it kinda seems like Goyer's never read a comic book in his entire life. Now, DC hadn't heard any of this before Man of Steel came out. I find it hard to believe this shining personality of his didn't come through in some way before, though. My point in going through all that is, does Goyer really sound like a guy who understands the moral subtleties of an uplifting character like Superman? Does he sound like someone who has any respect for the fans of Superman? And this is the guy they picked to write Man of Steel? I think this whole thing gives us some insight into what happened with Man of Steel. Because Goyer really does seem like a guy who'd say something like, "Superman's a pussy. Let's make him dark and cool, more like the Dark Knight." Which is the same kind of language I hear from people in YouTube and IGN comment sections trying to argue in favor of what Man of Steel did. This lack of respect definitely seems to show up in the movie. I have a feeling this is at least part of the reason you hear people say things like, Man of Steel isn't a Superman movie, it's an action movie for people who hate Superman. So let's bring this all together. Combine Christopher Nolan's consulting, David S. Goyer's writing, and Zack Snyder's directing. I think you've got three people who strongly prefer darkness and violence to inspiration and hopeful storytelling. We've essentially got three pessimists trying to tell a story about the most optimistic character in the history of fiction. In the end, I leave the question to you. Does that sound like a good recipe for a Superman movie?